The crystal halls of Vareth Prime had never felt so cold to Ambassador Aliles Vance as they did on this particular morning when he walked through the massive doors into the grand assembly chamber where the fate of his entire species would be decided by creatures who had already made up their minds about humanity long before he had even arrived. 12 elder species sat in their elevated positions around the circular room, and each one of them looked down at the lone human standing in the center of the chamber floor like he was some kind of interesting insect that had wandered into their territory by mistake. Elias kept his face calm and his hands steady at his sides, even though his heart was beating faster than it had in years, because he knew that showing any weakness here would only confirm what these aliens already believed about his kind. The Salanthi High Arbiter named Kethvorn rose from his crystalline throne at the highest point of the chamber, and his mantis-like body unfolded to its full impressive height of nearly 3 meters as ceremonial silks of deep purple and gold draped from his segmented limbs in patterns that indicated his supreme authority over this assembly. The Galactic Conclave has reviewed the petition submitted by the species known as humans from the planet designated Earth in the outer spiral arm of this galaxy. Kethvorn announced in a voice that echoed through the chamber with practiced authority and barely concealed disdain. Elias listened as the Arbiter listed the reasons why humanity would be denied full membership in the Conclave for yet another review cycle, and the words cut deeper each time. He heard phrases like aggressive biology, an unstable temperament, and insufficient civilizational maturity. The other delegates watched with expressions that ranged from bored indifference to open contempt, and not a single one of them spoke up in humanity's defense, even though Elias had spent the last 2 years trying to build relationships with each of their species. Therefore, it is the judgment of this assembly that the human species shall remain in probationary status for an additional period of 300 standard galactic years, during which time their colonies will be subject to increased taxation and their vessels will be restricted from entering any core system territories. Kethvorn declared with obvious satisfaction in his clicking voice. 300 more years of being treated like second-class citizens in a galaxy that humans had every right to explore and settle and call their own home, just like any other species that had reached the stars through their own effort and determination. Elias thought about the colonies back home where human families struggled under unfair trade regulations, and he thought about the young people who dreamed of traveling to distant worlds but could never afford the permits that other species obtained without any difficulty at all. He thought about his grandmother, who had been a refugee during the last Great War on Earth, and who had always told him that the measure of a person was not how they acted when things were easy, but how they stood up when everything seemed impossible. I request the right to address this assembly before your judgment is finalized, Elias said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the chamber without any trace of the anger he felt burning inside his chest. Kethvorn made a gesture with one of his upper limbs that clearly communicated dismissal and annoyance at this interruption to what he considered a completed matter. The judgment has been rendered human, and there is nothing further to discuss, so you may return to your quarters and prepare your departure from this station, as your presence is no longer required here. The other delegates began to shift in their seats, and some of them were already preparing to leave when Elias spoke again in a voice that stopped everyone in their tracks. Then I invoked the right of Calvor. The silence that fell over the chamber was so complete that Elias could hear the soft hum of the station's life support systems working somewhere deep in the walls around them. Kethvorn's compound eyes seemed to focus on the human with new intensity, and his mandibles clicked together several times before he spoke again in a tone that had lost some of its arrogant certainty. You cannot be serious about this human, because the right of Calvor has not been invoked in over 4,000 standard years, and the consequences of such a challenge are absolute and final. I am completely serious, Elias replied without any hesitation in his voice. "The right allows any species that has been denied standing in this assembly to challenge their accusers to trial by combat, and humanity formally invokes this right, as is permitted under the ancient laws that this conclave was founded upon." Murmurs spread through the assembly, as delegates turned to each other with expressions of shock and confusion, because none of them had ever witnessed such an event in their lifetimes, and many of them had believed the rite was nothing more than a historical curiosity from a more primitive era. "You would face death for this gesture of pride," Kethvorin said, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine curiosity beneath the layers of contempt. "Our champions are bred for combat across thousands of generations, while your species has barely learned to walk upright in the cosmic scale of things." Elias met the arbiter's gaze without flinching, and he allowed himself a small smile that confused the alien observers who had expected to see fear or desperation on the human's face. "Humanity accepts all consequences of this challenge as specified in the original terms of the rite," Elias stated formally. "We ask only that the combat take place within the standard waiting period so that both parties may prepare appropriately." Kethvorin was silent for a long moment, and his upper limbs made small movements that indicated deep thought or perhaps consultation with advisors through some method that humans could not perceive. "Very well, human," the arbiter finally said. "The right of Calver is accepted, and you will face our champion in the arena of ascension 3 rotations from now, where either your species will earn the right to be heard or you will die, and humanity will lose any chance of membership for the next 10,000 years. "I understand the terms," Elias said simply. As he turned to leave the chamber, he could feel the eyes of every delegate following him, and he knew that most of them expected to witness his death in 3 days' time. But Elias Vance had not survived 20 years as a UN peacekeeper, and another 10 as a diplomat in hostile territories, by giving up when the odds seemed impossible. He had come to Vareth Prime prepared for this moment, and now it was time to show the galaxy what a human from Earth was truly capable of when pushed to the edge. The doors closed behind him, and the real countdown began. The news of the human ambassador's challenge spread through Vareth Prime like wildfire through dry grass, and within hours every species on the station was talking about the unprecedented event that would take place in just 3 short days in the comfortable quarters of the Volanti delegation. A gelatinous being named Coordinator Tess floated in her suspension tank and accessed the galactic database to learn more about these strange humans who had dared to invoke the ancient right of Calver against the most powerful assembly in known space. What she found in those records made her entire body shiver with a fear she had not felt since she was a small child swimming in the dangerous currents of her homeworld's deep oceans. Earth was classified as a Category 7 Deathworld, which was the highest danger rating that the Conclave assigned to any planet capable of supporting life, and the reasons for this classification filled screen after screen of horrifying information. The planet had a gravity that was nearly twice the galactic standard for inhabited worlds, which meant that every human carried muscles and bones dense enough to survive forces that would crush most other species into paste. The atmosphere was filled with a highly reactive gas called oxygen that would cause severe chemical burns to many galactic species, and yet humans breathed this corrosive mixture every moment of their lives without any difficulty at all. Thess watched archival footage of humans engaging in something they called sports, and she could not believe what her visual sensors were showing her as these creatures ran for hours without stopping and threw objects with enough force to shatter stone and fought each other with their bare hands for entertainment. One particular video showed a human event called a marathon, where thousands of individuals ran a distance of over 40 kilometers without any mechanical assistance, and the winner completed this impossible journey in just over 2 hours while barely appearing tired at the end. How is this possible? Thesh whispered to herself as she continued to scroll through the data on human capabilities. She learned that humans were classified as persistents, predators, which meant that their ancestors had hunted other animals on their Deathworld, not through speed or strength, but through the simple, terrifying method of following their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. A human could track an animal for days without rest because their bodies had evolved cooling systems and energy storage capabilities that allowed them to outlast almost any other creature on their planet. Even more disturbing was the information about human healing abilities, because these creatures could recover from wounds that would kill most galactic species outright. Broken bones would mend themselves over time, and damaged organs could regenerate, and even lost blood could be replaced by the human body at a rate that seemed almost supernatural to species who had evolved on gentler worlds. Thesh shared her findings with the other delegates through the station's communication network, and soon the hallways of Vareth Prime were filled with whispered conversations about the true nature of the species that most of them had dismissed as primitive and weak in another part of the station. The Mordecai delegation was also reviewing information, but their focus was on the specific human who had issued the challenge, rather than the species as a whole. Commander Vex of the Mordecai warrior caste watched footage of Ambassador Elias Vance from his time as what humans called a peacekeeper, and he found himself growing more interested with each passing moment. The human moved with a controlled efficiency that spoke of extensive combat training, and his eyes showed none of the fear that Vex had expected to see in a creature facing certain death. This one is different from the other humans we have observed, Vex said to his subordinate who stood nearby in respectful silence. He carries himself like a warrior who has seen real battle and survived. Meanwhile, in his small quarters near the edge of the diplomatic section, Elias Vance was preparing for the challenge ahead in his own way. He had removed his formal ambassador's uniform and changed into simple exercise clothing, and now he moved through a series of physical routines that would have seemed ordinary to any human, but would have hospitalized most of the aliens on this station. Push-ups and pull-ups and squats and lunges flowed together in a continuous sequence that raised his heart rate and warmed his muscles while his mind focused on the task that lay ahead of him. A communication signal chimed, and Elias paused his workout to accept an incoming transmission from Earth that he had been expecting for several hours. The face of Admiral Chun appeared on his screen, and her expression was a mixture of concern and determination that Elias had seen many times during their years of working together. I received your report about the challenge. Elias and I need to know if you understand what you have done, the Admiral said, without any greeting or small talk. I understand. Perfectly, Admiral, Elias replied while wiping sweat from his forehead with a small towel. I have invoked an ancient law that gives humanity a chance to bypass 300 years of waiting and prove ourselves worthy of respect in a single afternoon. Or you could die and set our species back 10,000 years, which is a rather significant risk to take without consulting anyone back home first. Elias smiled at the Admiral's words because he knew that she was not actually angry with him but simply worried about the outcome of his decision. The Conclave was never going to accept us through normal channels, Admiral, because they are afraid of what we represent and afraid of what we might become if given equal standing with the elder species. And you think fighting their champion will make them less afraid of us? Chan asked with one eyebrow raised in skepticism. No, Elias admitted. I think it will make them understand that their fear is justified, but that we choose to use our strength for building rather than destroying, and that is a lesson they need to learn through demonstration rather than words. The Admiral was silent for a moment before she nodded slowly, and her expression softened just slightly. You always were too clever for your own good, Liz, but I suppose that is why we sent you in the first place. So do what you need to do and try not to die. If you can manage it, I will do my best, Admiral." The transmission ended, and Elias returned to his preparations. With renewed focus, because he had only 3 days to ready himself for a fight that would determine the future of his entire species. Somewhere in the warrior section of the station, a Mordecai champion named Thrax was also preparing, and he had already decided that killing this human would be the easiest victory of his long and bloody career. Neither of them knew how wrong that assumption would prove to be. The Arena of Ascension had not been used for its original purpose in over 4,000 years, and the maintenance crews had worked through 2 full rotation cycles to prepare the ancient chamber for the combat that was about to take place within. Its walls located at the very center of Vareth Prime Station. The arena was a massive circular space surrounded by rising tiers of observation galleries that could hold representatives from every species in the conclave, and today those galleries were filled to capacity with beings who had traveled from across the station to witness this historic event. High Arbiter Keth Voran sat in the position of highest honor directly above the arena floor, where he would have a perfect view of the human's death and the satisfaction of knowing that his judgment against humanity had been correct all along. The other delegates filled the surrounding seats, and their conversations created a buzzing murmur of anticipation that echoed off the crystalline walls and ceiling of the ancient chamber. Coordinator Thess of the Volanthi had positioned herself near the front of her delegation section because she wanted to see every detail of what was about to happen after spending the last 3 days learning about the terrifying capabilities of the human species. Part of her hoped that the human would somehow survive this encounter, but her logical mind told her that such an outcome was essentially impossible, given what she knew about the Mordecai warrior caste and their legendary combat abilities. Commander Vex of the Mordecai stood with his subordinates in a section reserved for the champion supporters, and his 4 arms were crossed over his armored chest as he waited for the contest to begin. He had watched more footage of the human ambassador during the waiting period, and his initial interest had grown into something that might have been called respect in another context. But respect did not change the outcome of combat, and Vex knew that his species champion would destroy this human, regardless of whatever training the soft-skinned creature might have received on his Deathworld home. A deep resonant tone echoed through the arena, signaling that the time for the rite of Culver had arrived, and the assembled delegates fell silent as all attention focused on the 2 entrances at opposite ends of the arena floor. The first entrance opened, and the Mordecai champion emerged into the light of the arena. To a chorus of clicks and hisses from his supporters in the galleries above, Thrax was an impressive specimen even by the standards of his warrior caste, and he stood over 2.5 meters tall, with an exoskeleton of deep black chitin that had been polished until it gleamed under the arena lights. 4 powerful arms extended from his upper body, and each one ended in serrated claws that could tear through metal plating with ease, while his lower body was supported by 4 thick legs that gave him stability and speed in equal measure. Ritual scars decorated his carapace in patterns that told the story of 17 previous victories in formal combat, and each of those scars represented an opponent who had died in his claws. Thrax moved to the center of the arena with a confidence that came from absolute certainty in his own abilities, and he raised all 4 arms to acknowledge the crowd that had gathered to watch him add another victory to his impressive record. Then the second entrance opened, and Elias Vance stepped into the arena of Ascension. The contrast between the 2 combatants could not have been more striking, and murmurs of confusion spread through the galleries as the delegates got there first. Look at the human who had dared to challenge the conclave's judgment. Elias was barely over 1.8 meters tall, and his body was covered in soft pink skin that showed no natural armor or protection of any kind. He wore simple clothing that left his arms and legs exposed, and he carried no weapons that any of the observers could identify. No armor protected his vital organs, and no Claws or fangs gave him any natural means of attack against an opponent like Thrax. Several delegates actually laughed at the sight because the human looked so pathetically small and weak compared to the massive Mordecai warrior who stood waiting for him in the center of the arena. "Is this some kind of joke?" one of the Salanti observers asked, loudly enough for his voice to carry across the chamber. "The human has come to his death, dressed for a casual meal." Elias ignored the laughter and the comments as he walked calmly to his position across from Thrax, and his eyes never left the Mordecai champion as he assessed his opponent with the practiced gaze of someone who had faced death many times before. Kethvorm rose from his seat, and the chamber fell silent once more as the High Arbiter prepared to formally begin the contest that would decide humanity's fate. The right of Calvor has been invoked by the human species against the judgment of this conclave, and their champion stands ready to face our chosen warrior in combat to the death or submission, Kethvorin announced in his clicking voice. "Let all who witness this contest remember that the outcome is final and binding upon all parties." Thrax flexed his claws and released a chemical signal that flooded the arena with the scent of predatory confidence, while his mandibles spread wide in what passed for a smile among his species. "You smell like fear, little human," Thrax rumbled in a voice like grinding stones. "Your body knows what your mind refuses to accept." Elias remained perfectly still, and his breathing was slow and controlled as he centered himself for what was about to happen. "That is not fear," Elias replied in a calm, steady voice. "That is adrenaline, and it is very different." Thrax made a sound that might have been laughter, and his forearms spread wide as he prepared to charge at the small, soft creature that stood before him. "I will make your death quick, human, because you have shown courage by coming here, and courage deserves some small measure of respect even from prey." "I appreciate the thought," Elias said, "but I did not come here to die." Kethvorm raised one limb high above his head, and the entire arena held its breath as the High Arbiter prepared to signal the beginning of combat. "Let the rite of Calvor begin," Kethvorm declared as his limbs swept downward. Thrax launched himself forward with all the speed and power that thousands of generations of warrior breeding had given his species, and Elias Vance moved to meet him. What happened in the arena of Ascension during the next few heartbeats would be studied and analyzed by military academies and xenobiologists across 100 worlds for generations to come. Thrax charged with all the terrifying speed of a Mordecai warrior, and his forearms spread wide to catch and crush the small human who stood in his path like a stone waiting to be shattered by an unstoppable wave. Every observer in the galleries expected to see the human torn apart in seconds, because that was simply how these things worked when a soft-skinned creature faced a purpose-bred killing machine. But Elias Vance did not retreat from the charging monster, and he did not freeze in fear as lesser beings might have done when confronted with certain death. Instead, he moved forward. The human advanced directly into the path of the Mordecai champion, and his body shifted in ways that seemed impossible to the watching aliens as muscles trained by Earth's crushing gravity responded with speed and precision that no Garden World species could match. Thrax's primary claws swept in from both sides in a killing strike, designed to catch the human in a pincer motion that would sever his body at the waist and end the fight before it truly began. Elias dropped, his body bent at angles that seemed to defy the structure of his skeleton as he ducked beneath the sweeping claws with centimeters to spare, and the deadly strike passed through empty air where his torso had been just a fraction of a second earlier. The human did not stop moving as he evaded the attack, but instead used his momentum to roll forward and come up inside the Mordecai's guard, where the longer reach of those forearms became a disadvantage rather than a strength. Thrax tried to bring his lower arms around to grab the human who had somehow appeared directly beneath him, but Elias was already striking before the Mordecai could adjust to this unexpected turn of events. The human's elbow drove upward with all the force that a Deathworld body could generate, and the point of impact was precisely targeted at the nerve cluster where Thrax's lower arms connected to his thorax. This was not a random blow, but a carefully calculated attack. Based on years of studying Mordecai anatomy and identifying the weaknesses that their armored bodies concealed beneath layers of chitin, the effect was immediate and devastating as Thrax's lower arms spasmed once and then went completely limp, while pain signals flooded his nervous system in ways that his warrior training had never prepared him to handle. A gasp rose from the assembled delegates as they watched their invincible champion stagger from a single blow delivered by a creature they had dismissed as weak and inferior. But Elias was not finished before Thrax could recover from the shock of the first strike. The human was already moving again with a speed and efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training and real combat experience. Elias struck the back of Thrax's primary knee joint with a precise kick that buckled the leg and forced the massive Mordecai down to a kneeling position where his head was finally at a level the human could reach in the galleries. Above, Commander Vex leaned forward with all four of his arms, gripping the railing in front of him as he watched something he had never expected to see in his lifetime. A human was defeating a Mordecai warrior caste champion in single combat. Thrax tried to swing his primary arms around to strike at the human who had somehow brought him to his knees, but his movements were slower now and hampered by the pain radiating from his disabled lower limbs. Elias caught one of the sweeping arms and redirected its force with a technique that used the Mordecai's own momentum against him, while simultaneously stepping behind the kneeling warrior. Then the human's hands found the gap between the armored plates that protected Thrax's head and neck, and his fingers locked into position around the Mordecai's cervical vertebrae with a grip that could not be broken. Thrax froze completely as he realized what had happened, because any movement now would cause the human's grip to sever his own spinal column and end his life in an instant. Arena of Ascension had gone completely silent, and every being in the galleries stared down at the impossible scene below them with expressions of shock and disbelief. A human held a Mordecai champion in a submission hold that would kill the warrior if he so much as twitched, and the entire fight had lasted less than 5 seconds from start to finish. "Yield," Elias said in a voice that was calm and steady and showed no signs of exertion. Despite what he had just accomplished, Thrax's mandibles clicked together several times as he processed the reality of his situation and the humiliation of being defeated by a creature that everyone had assured him would be easy prey. "I cannot yield to prey," Thrax growled through the pain and shame that flooded his warrior's mind. "I am not prey," Elias replied. "I am a human from Earth, and I am giving you a choice that I am not required to offer under the terms of this right." The human's grip tightened just slightly, and Thrax felt the pressure on his spine increase to a level that was one small movement away from death. "You can yield and live to fight again someday, or you can die here on this floor and be remembered as the warrior who was too proud to accept defeat with honor." The silence in the arena stretched for what felt like an eternity as everyone waited to see what the Mordecai champion would decide. "I yield," Thrax finally said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "The human has defeated me." Elias released his grip and stepped back from the kneeling Mordecai with the same calm, controlled movements he had displayed throughout the entire fight. He was not breathing hard, and his hands were steady at his sides as he turned to face the galleries where 12 elder species sat in stunned silence. "The rite of Calver is complete," Elias announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the arena. "Humanity claims the right to be heard." High Arbiter Kethvorin stared down at the human with compound eyes that could not process what they had just witnessed, and for the first time in his long career, he had absolutely no idea what to say. 4.7 seconds. That was all the time a Deathworld human had needed to defeat the greatest warrior the Conclave could put against him. The day after the combat in the Arena of Ascension, the Galactic Conclave gathered once more in the Grand Assembly Chamber, but the atmosphere was completely different from the last time Elias Vance had stood before them. Gone was the contempt and the dismissive arrogance that had filled the room during his first appearance, and in its place was something that looked very much like fear mixed with a cautious new respect. Elias stood in the center of the chamber floor wearing the same simple combat fatigues he had worn during his victory over Thrax, because he wanted these beings to remember exactly what they had witnessed and exactly who had accomplished it. High Arbiter Kethvorn sat in his elevated position, but he no longer looked down at the human with the superiority he had displayed before, and his compound eyes tracked Elias's every movement with the wariness of a creature who had learned that underestimating this species was a potentially fatal mistake under the ancient tomes of the Rite of Calvar. The human species has earned the right to address this assembly and have their petition reconsidered by the full conclave. Kethvorn announced in a voice that lacked its previous confidence. Ambassador Vance, you may speak. Elias looked around the chamber at the 12 elder species who had spent centuries treating humanity as an inconvenience to be managed rather than equals to be respected, and he took a moment to gather his thoughts before he began. You fear us, he said simply, and the words hung in the air like a challenge that none of the assembled delegates could deny. Every being in this room watched what happened in the arena yesterday, and every one of you is now asking the same question. He began to walk slowly among the lower tiers of the chamber and the delegates. He shifted uncomfortably as the human moved through their space with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he could be. The question you are asking is what would happen if humans decided to use their abilities for conquest instead of cooperation, and that question keeps you awake at night because you have finally realized that you have no good answer for it. Elias stopped in front of the Volanthi delegation, and Coordinator Thess met his gaze with her visual sensors, while her gelatinous body trembled slightly in her suspension tank. I know you spent the last 3 days researching my species coordinator, and I know what you found in those records, because I have read the same files and seen the same footage of what humans are capable of when we are pushed to our limits. Thess could not deny this, and she did not try, because the human was speaking the truth that everyone in the chamber already knew. But here is what those records do not tell you. Elias continued as he resumed his slow walk through the assembly. They do not tell you about the hospitals we have built on 100 colony worlds, or the teachers we have sent to help younger species develop their potential, or the ships we have dispatched to rescue stranded travelers, regardless of what species they belong to. He climbed the steps toward the higher tiers where the most powerful delegation sat, and none of them tried to stop him or object to his presence in their space. The records show you what humans can destroy, but they do not show you what we can create when we are given the chance to work alongside others instead of being forced to fight for every scrap of recognition. Elias stopped directly in front of Kethvorn's position, and the High Arbiter found himself unable to look away from the human's steady gaze, even though every instinct told him to flee from this predator who had proven himself capable of defeating the best warrior the Conclave could offer. I could have killed Thrax yesterday, Elias said quietly. Every human in this room could have done the same thing I did, because we all carry the strength of our Deathworld in our bones and our muscles and our stubborn refusal to surrender. He turned to address the full assembly once more, and his voice rose to fill the chamber with words that would be remembered and debated for centuries to come. But we do not want to rule through fear, and we do not want to build an empire on the broken bodies of species who simply did not understand what they were dealing with. Elias spread his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed everyone watching him from their elevated seats. What we want is to be your partners in exploring this incredible galaxy that we all share. And we want to be your allies when threats emerge that no single species can face alone, and we want to be your friends when the long cold night of space feels too empty and too dark. He lowered his arms and his voice became quiet but no less intense as he delivered his final message to the conclave that had spent so long trying to keep humanity in its place. So, here is my offer to all of you gathered in this chamber today, and it is the only offer I will ever make, because humanity does not beg, and we do not negotiate from a position of weakness. Elias looked directly at Kethvorin as he spoke the words. That would change galactic politics forever. Admit humanity as full members of this conclave with all the rights and responsibilities that come with that status, and let us prove what we can accomplish when we are working together instead of against each other. He paused and let the weight of his next words settle over the assembly like a blanket of ice, or continue to push us away and treat us as threats to be contained and learn. What happens when a Deathworld species decides that it has nothing left to lose? The silence that followed was the longest Elias had ever experienced, and he could see the calculations happening behind the eyes of every delegate as they weighed the risks and rewards of the choice he had presented to them. Finally, Kethvorin rose from his seat, and his voice was steady, even though his limbs trembled slightly as he spoke. The conclave will vote on the human petition for full membership, and the vote will be conducted immediately according to the ancient protocols. One by one, the delegations cast their votes, and one by one, the results appeared on the great display screen that dominated one wall of the chamber. The vote was unanimous in humanity's favor. Elias allowed himself a small smile as the final result was announced, and he nodded respectfully to the assembled delegates who had finally chosen wisdom over fear. 3 years later, a plague swept across Vereth VII and threatened to destroy the Salanti civilization that had looked down on humanity for so long. The first ships to arrive with medical supplies and volunteer doctors were human vessels crewed by men and women who worked around the clock to save lives regardless of how the Salanti had treated their species in the past. Human immune systems shrugged off infections that killed other species within hours, and human endurance allowed the medical teams to work shifts that no other volunteers could match. Kethvorin watched from his hospital bed as human doctors carried his dying people to safety, and he finally understood what Ambassador Vance had tried to tell him in that chamber so long ago. Humans were not dangerous because they could destroy anything that stood in their way. They were dangerous because they chose not to, and that made all the difference in the galaxy.